The rain fell like needles against the windshield of Detective Mark Holloway's sedan. It was the kind of night that belonged in black and white films, dark, damp, and foreboding. Lightning illuminated the Brooklyn streets in brief flashes, revealing the worn buildings and empty sidewalks of a neighborhood most people avoided after dark. "We've got a 1071 at Greenpoint Self-Storage, possible B&E in progress," the dispatcher's voice crackled through the radio. Security alarm triggered, no visual confirmation yet. Mark glanced at his partner, Detective Sarah Chen. "That's the third storage facility hit this month. Same MO as our storage bandit?" "Has to be," Sarah replied, flipping through her notes. "Always during storms, always between midnight and 2 a.m. Professional enough to disable most cameras, but sloppy enough to trigger alarms." They arrived at the facility within minutes, parking a block away to approach on foot. The security guard was waiting with his flashlight, nervously shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Someone cut the fence in the back," he explained, leading them around the building. "I didn't see anyone, but the alarm for Unit 237 was triggered about 10 minutes ago." Mark and Sarah drew their weapons and entered the facility, moving silently through the maze of storage units. They could hear faint metallic sounds coming from somewhere ahead, the unmistakable sound of someone trying to work quietly with tools. As they rounded the corner, they saw him, a man in dark clothing, crouched in front of an open storage unit, his back to them. A small flashlight was wedged between his teeth as he sorted through boxes. "Police! Freeze!" Mark shouted, his weapon trained on the suspect. The man jumped to his feet, dropping several items. For a split second, it looked like he might run, but instead, he slowly raised his hands. "Turn around, slowly," Sarah commanded. The man complied. In the beam of their flashlights, they saw a middle-aged man with graying temples and tired eyes. Nothing about him screamed, "professional thief." If anything, in his worn jeans and faded jacket, he looked ordinary, forgettable. "I can explain," the man said, his voice steady despite the circumstances. Mark approached cautiously, securing the suspect's hands behind his back with handcuffs. "You can explain downtown. You have the right to remain silent." As Mark continued reciting the Miranda rights, Sarah examined the storage unit. It contained mostly old furniture, photo albums, and boxes labeled Daniel's Things or family albums. Nothing that seemed particularly valuable. "What's your name?" Sarah asked after Mark finished. "Michael Reed," the man replied, "and this is all a misunderstanding." "Sure it is," Mark said, having heard that line countless times before. "Let's go." At the precinct, Michael Reed sat quietly in the interrogation room. His fingerprints revealed no prior arrests, and his background check came back clean. Too clean, almost. He had a New York driver's license issued just 8 months ago, an apartment lease in Queens starting around the same time, and a job as a night janitor at an office building. Before that, there was virtually nothing. Either this guy's been living off the grid, or someone did a very thorough job of establishing a new identity, Sarah mused, reviewing the preliminary report. Mark nodded. "Let's see what story he's selling." Inside the interrogation room, Michael sat with perfect posture, his cuffed hands resting on the table. He didn't fidget or sweat like most suspects. He simply waited, his eyes focused on the door as if expecting someone. "Mr. Reed," Mark began, settling into the chair across from him. "Want to tell us what you were doing breaking into a storage unit at 1 a.m. during a thunderstorm?" "I wasn't breaking in," Michael replied calmly. "Unit 237 belongs to me." Sarah raised an eyebrow. "We checked the facility records. Unit 237 is registered to a Daniel Farrow." Something flickered across Michael's face, a shadow of emotion quickly controlled. "Daniel Farrow was my brother. He died 16 months ago." "And you have documentation to prove this relationship?" Mark pressed. "Not with me, but if you check my apartment, in the desk drawer, there's a folder with his death certificate and will. He left everything to me." Mark made a note. "That still doesn't explain why you were breaking in rather than using a key." Michael sighed. "I lost the key. I've been meaning to go there for months, but I work nights and the office is only open during the day. Tonight was my night off, and I couldn't wait anymore." What was so urgent that it couldn't wait for business hours? Sarah asked. Michael looked down at his hands. My brother and I hadn't spoken in years. We had a falling out. When I learned he died, I also learned he'd been looking for me. That storage unit contains the only things I have left of him, of my old life. Mark and Sarah exchanged glances. It sounded plausible, even sympathetic, but something wasn't adding up. We'll need to verify your story, Mark said, standing up. In the meantime, you're being charged with breaking and entering. Michael didn't protest as he was processed and placed in a holding cell. He simply asked that they be careful with the contents of the storage unit, especially a wooden box he'd been examining when they arrested him. The next morning, Sarah arrived at the precinct early with 2 coffees and a troubled expression. You look like you've seen a ghost, Mark commented, accepting the coffee. Maybe I have, she replied, opening a file on her desk. I went through everything we brought back from the storage unit. There's something weird about this Michael Reed. She spread out several items, old photos, letters, newspaper clippings, and documents. Look at these photos. This is supposedly Daniel Farrow, the deceased brother, throughout his life. Mark examined the photos. They showed a boy growing into a teenager, then a young man with a bright smile. The resemblance to Michael Reed was clear. And here's where it gets strange, Sarah continued, pointing to a newspaper clipping from 15 years ago. Daniel Farrow was a whistleblower at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. He exposed illegal drug trials that the company was conducting, trials that resulted in several deaths. I remember that case, Mark said, frowning. It was huge. The CEO went to prison. Right. And after his testimony, Daniel Farrow entered the witness protection program. He disappeared. Mark leaned back, connecting the dots. Are you saying our suspect isn't Michael Reed but Daniel Farrow, the supposedly dead brother? That's my theory, Sarah nodded. But here's where it gets complicated. I found this death certificate for Daniel Farrow, dated 16 months ago. Car accident in Oregon. It looks legitimate. So either Daniel Farrow is really dead and Michael Reed is who he says he is, or Daniel faked his death a second time, Sarah finished. But why would he break into his own storage unit? Their conversation was interrupted by Officer Jenkins. Detectives, there's someone here to see you. Says it's about Michael Reed. The visitor was a woman in her 50s, professionally dressed with silver-streaked hair. She introduced herself as Margaret Wilson from the U.S. Marshals Service. I understand you arrested a man calling himself Michael Reed last night, she said once they were seated in a private room. That's correct, Mark confirmed cautiously. I need to speak with him immediately. This is a matter of national security. Sarah leaned forward. Is he Daniel Farrow, a protected witness? Margaret's expression revealed nothing. I'm not authorized to discuss that. I simply need to verify his identity. With all due respect, Ms. Wilson, Mark said, we need more information before we release a suspect into your custody. After a tense negotiation, Margaret reluctantly shared limited information. The man they knew as Michael Reed had indeed been in witness protection, but not as Daniel Farrow. His real name was classified, but he had been a key witness in a case involving Meridian Pharmaceuticals 15 years ago. After the trial, he received death threats, Margaret explained. He was relocated with a new identity as Robert Millerton. 6 years ago, there was an attempt on his life. We moved him again, this time as Daniel Farrow. And now he's Michael Reed, Sarah concluded. But why was he breaking into his own storage unit? Margaret hesitated. That storage facility is a dead drop, a secure location where protected witnesses can leave messages or items for their handlers. Daniel, or Michael, as you know him, shouldn't have been there at all. He was supposed to have left the state months ago for yet another relocation. When they brought Michael Reed back into the interrogation room, he looked resigned, as if he'd been expecting this moment for years. Hello, Margaret, he said quietly. You disappeared, Margaret replied, her professional demeanor cracking slightly. We thought they'd found you. Michael shook his head. No one found me. I chose to disappear. Over the next hour, the truth emerged in fragments. The man they knew as Michael Reed had been born Jason Mercer, a former research scientist at Meridian Pharmaceuticals. When he discovered that the company was falsifying safety data for a new drug, He became the whistleblower who brought down the corporation. But that's not the whole story, Jason admitted. Before I went to the authorities, I made copies of all the research data. There was something in those trial results, something revolutionary buried under all the corruption. The wooden box from the storage unit, Sarah realized. Jason nodded. For 15 years I've been living other people's lives, always looking over my shoulder. But I couldn't leave my research behind. That drug, despite its flaws, showed promise for treating certain forms of early-onset dementia. The company was rushing it to market before it was safe, but the core science was sound. Why disappear from witness protection? Mark asked. Because I wanted my life back, Jason said simply. And because I've spent the last decade refining that research in secret. I'm close to a breakthrough, a safe version of the treatment. But to publish it, to bring it to the world, I need to reclaim my real identity. Margaret shook her head. That's not possible. There are still people who want you dead. The CEO who threatened me died in prison 3 years ago, Jason countered. His son, who took over what remained of the company assets, publicly apologized for his father's actions. The danger has passed. You can't know that for certain, Margaret insisted. The debate continued until Jason made a startling revelation. He'd been living as Michael Reed, out of protection, for 8 months. No attempts had been made on his life. He'd even cautiously reached out to former colleagues who could help validate and advance his research. I need to be Jason Mercer again, he pleaded. People with early-onset dementia need this treatment. I've sacrificed 15 years of my life. I've lived as 3 different people. I've lost everyone I ever loved. Isn't that enough? Mark and Sarah found themselves in an unusual position, mediators between a former protected witness and the very program designed to keep him safe. The next few days involved complex negotiations with the Marshal Service, verification of Jason's claims about the reduced threat to his life, and examination of the research he'd been secretly continuing. A week later, Jason Mercer walked out of the precinct a free man, not as Michael Reed or Daniel Farrow, but under his real name for the first time in 15 years. What will you do now? Sarah asked as she returned his belongings. Jason smiled, a genuine expression that transformed his face. First, I'm going to publish my research under my real name. Then I'm going to find my sister. She thinks I've been dead for 15 years. And the charges? Mark inquired. Dropped, Sarah confirmed. Can't charge a man for breaking into his own storage unit, especially one the Marshal Service had designated as his dead drop. Besides, the facility manager confirmed that Daniel Farrow, one of Jason's previous identities, was indeed the registered renter. As Jason prepared to leave, he paused. You know, when you arrested me that night, I was terrified. But now I'm grateful. If you hadn't caught me, I might have spent the rest of my life looking over my shoulder, living someone else's life. 3 months later, Mark and Sarah received a package at the precinct. Inside was a scientific journal with a highlighted article, Breakthrough in Early Onset Dementia Treatment, by Dr. Jason Mercer. With it was a note that simply read, Sometimes being caught is the first step toward being free. Thank you. The case of the storage bandit was officially closed, but its impact continued to resonate. Jason's research went on to clinical trials, showing promising results. Mark and Sarah occasionally saw him on the news, speaking passionately about neurodegenerative diseases and patient advocacy. Not bad for the wrong man in the right place, Sarah commented during one such news segment. Mark nodded, remembering the night in the rain when they'd arrested a supposed thief only to uncover a man trying to reclaim his stolen life. Makes you wonder how many other secrets are locked away in storage units across the city, or how many people are living lives that don't belong to them, Sarah added thoughtfully. Outside, rain began to fall again, washing the city streets clean as it had on that fateful night. Somewhere across town, Jason Mercer was finally living as himself, his unbelievable secret no longer a burden to carry alone. And 2 detectives had learned that sometimes the wrong arrest could lead to the right outcome in the most unexpected ways. As 6 months after Jason Mercer reclaimed his identity, Detective Sarah Chen found herself standing outside his downtown laboratory, hesitating before entering. What had begun as routine follow-up had evolved into something more complex. Jason had called her directly, requesting a meeting, saying only that there were complications regarding his past. Inside, Jason's lab was immaculate. White counters, sophisticated equipment, and walls covered with brain scans and molecular diagrams. Jason himself looked different, more confident, standing straighter, his formerly guarded expression replaced with one of purpose. "Thank you for coming," he said, gesturing toward his office. "I wasn't sure who else to contact." Once they were seated, Jason slid a folder across his desk. "3 days ago, I received this." Sarah opened it to find photographs. Jason entering his apartment, Jason at a coffee shop, Jason in his lab. Surveillance photos. With them was a note that simply read, "Some debts can't be erased by time." "Someone from Meridian?" Sarah asked, examining the images. "I thought so initially," Jason replied. "But look at the timestamps. These were taken within days of my identity becoming public again. Too fast for someone just discovering I'm alive." Sarah studied the photos more carefully. "You think someone's been watching you all along, even in witness protection? It would explain how they found me the first time, 6 years ago." Jason ran a hand through his hair. "I've been thinking about it constantly. The only people who knew all my identities were within the Marshal Service." "You suspect a leak in the program?" Sarah asked, alarmed. "Or worse, someone using it to track people like me." Over the next few weeks, Sarah and Mark delved into Jason's case unofficially. They discovered troubling patterns. 3 other protected witnesses connected to corporate whistleblowing cases had died in accidents over the past decade. All had been relocated multiple times, suggesting their new identities had somehow been compromised. Their investigation led them to Margaret Wilson's supervisor, Deputy Marshal Richard Tellman, who had overseen all 4 witness cases. When confronted, Tellman denied any wrongdoing and warned them about pursuing conspiracy theories that could damage the program's reputation. But as they dug deeper, financial records revealed suspicious deposits into offshore accounts linked to Tellman, deposits that coincided with each witness relocation. The last deposit had come shortly after Jason's most recent identity change. "He's been selling information," Mark concluded. "The question is, to whom?" The answer came from an unexpected source. Caroline Westfield, the current CEO of what remained of Meridian Pharmaceuticals, now rebranded as Lumina Biotech, reached out to Jason directly. "My father committed terrible crimes," she admitted during their meeting. "But I'm not him. When I took over the company, I discovered files suggesting he had maintained a contact within the Marshal Service, someone who had been tracking you and others." "Why tell me this now?" Jason asked. "Because whoever it is, they're still active, and they don't work for me." Caroline pushed a flash drive across the table. "This contains everything I found. I want to make amends for my family's actions, Dr. Mercer. What my father did to you and others was unforgivable." The flash drive provided the final pieces they needed. Tellman had initially been paid by Meridian's former CEO, but had continued selling information to other interested parties after the CEO's death, including competitor pharmaceutical companies and even private revenge seekers with grudges against whistleblowers. With sufficient evidence, Sarah and Mark brought the case to the FBI. Tellman was arrested quietly, and a larger investigation into witness security breaches began. Jason's stalker turned out to be a private investigator hired by one of Meridian's former board members, a man who had lost millions when the company collapsed. As the case concluded, Jason invited Sarah and Mark to his lab for what he called a proper thank you. He showed them his research facility, where clinical trials for his dementia treatment were showing remarkable results. "None of this would have been possible if you hadn't arrested me that night," Jason said, pouring champagne for a toast. "First for giving me back my identity, and now for ensuring I can keep it." "Just doing our job," Mark replied modestly. "No," Jason shook his head. "Your job was to arrest a thief. What you did went far beyond that. You helped restore not just my name, but my purpose." Sarah raised her glass. "To second chances. And to the secrets that lead us to the truth," Jason added. As they clinked glasses, Sarah reflected on how a routine B&E call on a rainy night had unraveled a conspiracy and, in the process, helped advance medical science. Sometimes, she thought, the most important discoveries come from the most unexpected places, including a storage unit in Brooklyn during a thunderstorm. Jason's treatment eventually received FDA approval, offering hope to thousands of early-onset dementia patients. The man who had lived 3 different lives finally settled comfortably into the one that had been taken from him. And 2 detectives learned that in their line of work, things were rarely as simple as right or wrong, guilty or innocent. Sometimes, arresting the wrong man was exactly the right thing to do.